Samuel Richardson's weathered hands trembled as he held the Purple Heart medal, its bronze surface catching the last rays of Arizona sunset. 3 years had passed since Margaret's funeral. 3 years of bourbon-soaked nights and conversations with her gravestone. But what he was about to discover on that dusty October evening would shatter everything he thought he knew about loss, loyalty, and the ghosts that follow soldiers home from war. The German Shepherd puppy lying motionless beside Highway 60 shouldn't have survived the desert heat. Yet those intelligent brown eyes held secrets that would unlock a 50-year-old mystery buried deeper than the bodies Sam left behind in Vietnam. Sometimes guardian angels arrive when you least expect them, wearing fur instead of wings, carrying answers to questions you were too afraid to ask. What Sam found that Tuesday night wouldn't just save his life, it would expose the darkest conspiracy in Millbrook's quiet history and prove that some bonds transcend death itself. The truth was more unbelievable than he could have ever imagined. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The high desert town of Millbrook, Arizona stretched across 5,000 acres of scrubland and broken dreams, where the Sonoran Desert met the ghosts of better times. Population 3,200 on a good day, when the snowbirds hadn't fled back north, and the young folks hadn't yet discovered there was nothing here worth staying for. Samuel Richardson had called this place home for 43 years, ever since he'd returned from Vietnam with shrapnel in his leg and shadows in his mind that no Purple Heart could heal. At 68, Sam carried himself like a man who'd learned that the world breaks everyone eventually, and those who don't break get killed. His ranch sat 5 miles outside town on a dirt road that turned to soup when the monsoons came, which they rarely did anymore. 5 acres of stubborn earth where he'd built a life with Margaret, where they'd tried for children that never came, and where he now tended her rose garden with the devotion of a man keeping a promise to the dead. The house itself was modest, a 1970s ranch style with a wraparound porch that faced west toward the mountains. Margaret had painted it yellow once, back when hope came easier. Now the desert sun had faded it to the color of old bones, which seemed fitting enough. Inside, everything remained exactly as she'd left it 3 years ago. Her coffee cup still sat beside the kitchen sink, her reading glasses folded on the nightstand, her romance novels bookmarked on pages she'd never finish. Sam's daily routine had become a ritual of remembrance. Coffee at 0500 hours, old habits from the army died hard, followed by 20 minutes of watering Margaret's roses while the desert air still held a trace of coolness. He'd built the garden for her 40th birthday, trucking in good soil and installing a drip irrigation system that had cost more than his first car. She'd cried when she saw it, not because of the roses, but because she understood what he couldn't say, that he'd finally found something worth nurturing instead of destroying. The bourbon came out each evening at sunset, along with the memories he couldn't seem to bury deep enough. Some nights, he talked to Margaret's grave marker in the backyard, telling her about his day, asking forgiveness for things that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a war that had ended 50 years ago but still raged in his chest. Other nights, he just sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one over the desert, wondering why he'd been allowed to come home when better men hadn't. Tuesday evening, October 15th, arrived like any other in Millbrook. Hot, dry, and painted in shades of amber that made everything look like an old photograph. Sam had driven into town for supplies, his ancient Ford pickup rattling down Highway 60 with the windows down and the radio playing some forgettable country song about lost love and second chances. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Safeway trip had been routine. Frozen dinners, bourbon, dog food for the strays that sometimes wandered onto his property. Margaret used to cook real meals, filling the house with the smell of pot roast and cornbread. Now Sam lived on hungry man dinners and memories, though he still bought ingredients he'd never use, as if keeping up the pretense might somehow bring her back. It was on the return journey, just as the sun began its descent behind the Superstition Mountains, that Sam spotted something dark against the roadside gravel. At first he thought it might be roadkill. Coyotes and jackrabbits didn't stand much chance against the 18-wheelers that thundered through here day and night. But as his truck drew closer, the dark shape moved. Sam pulled over, dust swirling around his tires as he killed the engine. The desert evening was still, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic. He climbed out slowly, his bad leg protesting after the drive, and approached what he now could see was a dog. A puppy, actually, a German shepherd that couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 months old. The little animal lay on its side, panting heavily in the residual heat radiating from the asphalt. Its coat was the classic black and tan of the breed, though dulled with dust and dehydration. What struck Sam immediately were the eyes. Dark brown and intelligent, holding a depth that seemed impossible for something so young. They fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Easy there, soldier," Sam murmured, using the same gentle tone he'd once reserved for wounded men in rice paddies half a world away. He knelt beside the puppy, ignoring the protest in his knees. The animal didn't try to bite or flee, just watched him with those unsettling eyes. "Where'd you come from, huh?" There was no collar, no identification. The puppy was thin but not emaciated, suggesting it hadn't been abandoned for long. Sam looked around the empty desert landscape, seeing nothing but scrub brush and telephone poles stretching to the horizon. The nearest ranch was miles away, and nobody in their right mind would dump a purebred German shepherd in the middle of nowhere. He fetched a bottle of water from his truck and cupped his hands, letting the puppy lap desperately at the small pool. The animal drank with careful efficiency, not the frantic gulping Sam expected. When it had enough, it looked up at him again with those knowing eyes, as if waiting for his next move. "Well, I can't just leave you here," Sam said, though he wasn't sure why he was talking to a dog that couldn't understand him. "Coyotes'll get you before morning, and that's if the heat doesn't finish you first." The puppy struggled to sit up, wobbling slightly but managing to maintain the position. It tilted its head at Sam's words, ears perked forward in an almost human gesture of attention. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, man and animal studied each other in the fading light. Margaret's voice echoed in Sam's memory. "Sam, you can't save everyone, but you can save someone." She'd said that about the strays they'd taken in over the years, the wounded birds, the occasional lost hiker who'd wandered onto their property. She'd had a gift for seeing the broken things that could still be mended. The decision made itself. Sam scooped up the puppy, surprised by how little it weighed, and carried it to his truck. The animal didn't struggle or whine, just pressed against his chest with what felt like gratitude. As Sam settled it on the passenger seat, the puppy's eyes never left his face. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, the puppy sitting perfectly still despite the truck's rough ride. Sam found himself glancing over repeatedly, struck by how the animal seemed to be studying the landscape they passed, as if memorizing landmarks. When they turned into his driveway, the puppy's ears pricked up with what looked like recognition, though that was impossible. It had never been here before. That first night, Sam set up a makeshift bed on the kitchen floor using old towels and a cardboard box. He opened a can of the dog food he'd bought for strays and watched the puppy eat with the same careful efficiency it had shown while drinking. When bedtime came, Sam expected to hear whining or scratching at doors. Instead, he woke the next morning to find the puppy sleeping peacefully beside Margaret's photograph on the nightstand, as if it had been guarding her memory through the night. Sam named the puppy Ranger on Wednesday morning, watching as the young German shepherd explored the ranch with methodical precision that reminded him of military reconnaissance. The name felt right somehow, though Sam couldn't put his finger on why. There was something about the way the dog moved, alert, purposeful, scanning the horizon like a soldier on patrol. The first sign that Ranger wasn't ordinary came during their morning walk around the property. Sam had been checking the fence line, a routine task he'd performed 1,000 times since Margaret's death. But this time, Ranger suddenly froze near the old tool shed, ears rigid and focused on something Sam couldn't see or hear. The puppy's posture shifted into what looked suspiciously like a military alert position, low, balanced, ready for action. "What is it, boy?" Sam asked, following the dog's gaze toward a patch of scrub brush that looked identical to every other patch on his 5 acres. Ranger padded forward, nose to the ground, and began digging with surprising determination. Within minutes, his small paws had unearthed something that made Sam's blood run cold. It was a tripwire, ancient and rusted but still intact, the kind Sam had learned to make and detect during his combat engineer training 47 years ago. But that was impossible. He'd never practiced such things on his own land, and no one else had reason to bury military ordnance in the Arizona desert. Yet, there it was, exactly the type of booby trap he'd dismantled in the jungle swamps of Vietnam. Sam stared at the corroded wire, his mind racing. Had he buried this himself during some bourbon-fueled flashback he couldn't remember? The thought terrified him more than the discovery itself. PTSD could play cruel tricks on a man's memory, make him do things he'd later forget. But Ranger's behavior suggested otherwise. The puppy wasn't acting like he'd stumbled across something random. He'd sought it out, identified it, marked it for disposal exactly as a trained canine would. That afternoon brought the first visit from Marcus Webb, though Sam didn't recognize the name when the man introduced himself. Webb arrived in a silver Mercedes that looked like it cost more than Sam's annual pension, stepping out in a tailored suit that seemed ridiculous in the desert heat. He was younger than Sam had expected, maybe 45, with the soft look of a man who'd never worked with his hands, but the cold eyes of someone who'd learned to use other tools to get what he wanted. "Mr. Richardson," Webb said, extending a manicured hand that felt like gripping a dead fish. "I'm Marcus Webb. I represent Sonoran Sky Development Corporation. I believe my office contacted you about a potential land acquisition?" Sam let the handshake linger longer than comfortable, a old interrogation technique that usually made people squirm. Webb didn't flinch. "Yeah, I got your letters. Threw them in the trash where they belong." Webb smiled, the practiced expression of a man accustomed to resistance. "I understand your attachment to this place, Mr. Richardson. 43 years is a long time to call somewhere home, but I'm authorized to make you an offer that would set you up very comfortably for your remaining years. $3.2 million for the full 5 acres. The number hung in the desert air like a mirage. Sam could live like a king on that kind of money, buy himself a nice condo in Scottsdale with a golf course view, and forget about maintaining fences and irrigation systems. But the thought of strangers building condominiums where Margaret's roses grew made his stomach turn. "Not interested," Sam said flatly. "This land isn't for sale." Webb's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I respect that, Mr. Richardson. But perhaps you should consider the practical aspects of your situation. You're not a young man anymore. This property requires significant upkeep, and the isolation can't be healthy for someone in your circumstances." The careful emphasis on circumstances made Sam's jaw tighten. He'd dealt with condescending bureaucrats before, men who thought a uniform or a title gave them the right to talk down to soldiers who'd bled for their freedom. "My circumstances are fine, thanks. You can see yourself out." But Webb wasn't finished. "There are also tax considerations to think about. Property assessments in this county have been, volatile lately. It would be unfortunate if you found yourself unable to afford the increases that are certainly coming." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sam had heard enough veiled intimidation in his life to recognize it when he encountered it again. "Is that supposed to scare me? Son, I've been shot at by people a lot more motivated than you. Take your offer and your threats and get off my property." As Webb climbed back into his Mercedes, Ranger emerged from wherever he'd been exploring and positioned himself between Sam and the departing car. The puppy's hackles were raised, his small body tense with protective instinct that seemed far too mature for his age. He watched the silver car disappear down the dirt road with the focused intensity of a sentry marking potential enemies. That evening, Sam sat on his porch with a glass of bourbon and tried to make sense of the day's events. Ranger lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to scan the darkening desert as if expecting trouble. The puppy's vigilance was starting to unnerve Sam. It reminded him too much of Duke, his canine partner in Vietnam, a German shepherd who'd had the same uncanny ability to sense danger before it materialized. Duke had saved Sam's life more times than he could count, detecting tripwires, warning of ambushes, finding wounded soldiers in the aftermath of firefights. The bond between them had been forged in blood and mud, strengthened by shared trauma and mutual dependence. When Duke had died, torn apart by the same mortar round that had killed Jimmy Cooper, Sam had felt like he'd lost a brother. Now, watching Ranger's alert posture and intelligent eyes, Sam felt an uncomfortable prickle of déjà vu. The similarity was too strong to be coincidence, but coincidence was the only rational explanation. German shepherds were naturally protective, naturally intelligent. It didn't mean anything that this particular puppy reminded him of a dog that had died half a century ago on the other side of the world. The next morning brought Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Millbrook's only veterinarian, for a house call Sam had reluctantly scheduled. He'd found Mitchell's card in Margaret's address book. Apparently, she'd been the one to treat the various strays Margaret had insisted on nursing back to health over the years. Mitchell was younger than Sam had expected, maybe 40, with calloused hands and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who spent her days with creatures that couldn't lie about their pain. "So this is your new companion," she said, kneeling beside Ranger with professional competence. The puppy submitted to her examination without protest, though his eyes never left Sam's face. "He's in remarkable condition for a stray. Well-nourished, clean, obviously socialized. Someone took good care of him before he ended up on that highway." Mitchell continued her examination, checking Ranger's teeth, eyes, and ears with practiced efficiency. But Sam noticed her frowning as she worked, her movements becoming more deliberate. When she finally looked up, her expression was puzzled. "Mr. Richardson, this dog has been professionally trained. I can see evidence of early discipline work, possibly even specialized conditioning. His muscle development suggests regular, structured exercise regimens. This isn't some abandoned puppy. This is valuable breeding stock, possibly worth thousands of dollars." The implications hit Sam like a physical blow. If Ranger was valuable, if he belonged to someone who'd invested serious money in his training, then keeping him was theft. But more troubling was the question of how such a valuable animal had ended up dying of dehydration beside a desert highway. People didn't accidentally lose dogs worth thousands of dollars. "There's something else," Mitchell said, her voice dropping to the careful tone doctors used when delivering difficult news. "His reactions to certain stimuli suggest military or police training protocols. The way he responds to your vocal commands, his alert postures, I've seen this before in working dogs. But he's too young to have completed any formal program. It's like someone started training him from birth for a very specific purpose." That night, Sam lay awake, listening to the desert wind rattle his windows and wondering what kind of purpose would require training a puppy from birth. Beside him, Ranger slept with the stillness of a professional soldier, but his ears twitched at every sound, ready to wake at the first sign of trouble. Whatever secrets the young dog carried, Sam was beginning to suspect they were connected to forces he didn't understand and might not be able to control. The first week of November brought unseasonable heat to Millbrook, the kind of dry furnace wind that made tempers short and water bills high. Sam had fallen into a routine with Ranger that felt as natural as breathing. Morning walks around the property, afternoon training sessions that the dog seemed to anticipate before Sam even reached for the leash, and quiet evenings on the porch where Ranger would position himself like a four-legged sentry scanning the desert for threats that never materialized. But threats, Sam was learning, came in many forms. Marcus Webb's second visit arrived with the morning mail delivered not by the man himself, but by Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose patrol car kicked up enough dust to choke a horse as it pulled into Sam's driveway. Bradley was a thick-set man in his 50s who'd held the sheriff's office for nearly 2 decades, long enough to develop the comfortable corruption that comes with unchallenged authority in a small town. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his badge always polished, but his eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who'd learned to look the other way for the right price. "Morning, Sam," Bradley said, climbing out of his cruiser with the deliberate slowness of someone who wanted to be seen doing his job. "Got some paperwork for you. Seems there's been some questions raised about your property taxes." Sam accepted the manila envelope with steady hands, though his gut was already twisting. Inside were documents that made his blood pressure spike. A reassessment notice that tripled his annual property tax, backdated to include penalties for the previous 3 years. The total amount due was more than his annual pension. "This is bullshit, Tom," Sam said, not bothering to hide his anger. "This land's been assessed at the same value for 15 years. You can't just arbitrarily triple it overnight." Bradley shrugged with practiced indifference. "County assessor says there's been significant development potential discovered in this area. Infrastructure improvements, tourist accessibility, that kind of thing. Makes the land more valuable, which means higher taxes. Simple math." But nothing about this was simple, and they both knew it. Sam had seen enough bureaucratic warfare to recognize a coordinated attack when he encountered one. Webb's polite offer had been refused, so now came the pressure campaign, death by 1,000 administrative cuts until Sam had no choice but to sell. "I want to see the surveyor's report," Sam said. "The environmental impact study, the traffic analysis that justifies this reassessment." "That's between you and the county office," Bradley replied, but his discomfort was visible. "I'm just delivering papers." After the sheriff left, Sam called the county assessor's office and spent an hour being transferred between departments that claimed no knowledge of any development studies or infrastructure plans. It was a master class in bureaucratic stonewalling, designed to exhaust and frustrate rather than inform. By the time Sam hung up, he understood exactly what he was facing: a system that had been purchased and was now being wielded like a weapon. That afternoon brought an unexpected ally in the form of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who arrived unannounced with a bottle of bourbon and a grim expression. She found Sam on his porch, staring at the tax documents spread across a folding table like battle plans. "Heard about your reassessment," she said without preamble, settling into Margaret's old chair. "Same thing happened to the Hendersons last month and the Washingtons before that. Anyone who won't sell to Webb's development company suddenly discovers their taxes have gone through the roof." Sam poured 2 glasses of bourbon, grateful for the company and the confirmation that his paranoia was justified. "How many families has he pushed out?" 7 so far. All of them small ranchers, all of them with property that borders the main highway. Webb's been buying up a corridor of land that runs from the interstate all the way to the state park. Perfect location for a luxury resort and golf course, assuming you can get rid of the current residents. Mitchell sipped her bourbon and watched Ranger, who was performing his evening patrol of the property perimeter with military precision. "There's something else you should know. I did some research after examining your dog. German Shepherds like him aren't bred locally. The closest facilities that produce that quality of training are either military installations or private security companies. And none of them just lose dogs worth $20,000. The number hit Sam like a physical blow. $20,000. That was more than most people made in a year. Certainly more than a retired veteran living on a fixed income could afford to keep. If Ranger's original owners came looking for him, Sam would have no legal right to refuse their claim. "There's more," Mitchell continued. "I made some calls to colleagues in Phoenix and Tucson. 3 other German Shepherd puppies matching Ranger's description have been reported stolen from a private breeding facility in the past 2 months. All of them were part of an experimental program developing dogs for specialized security work." The implications were staggering. Either Ranger was stolen goods that would eventually be claimed by his rightful owners, or he'd escaped from whatever program had produced him. Neither possibility offered comfort to a man who'd already grown attached to the young dog's presence. That night, Sam's dreams were haunted by memories of Vietnam. Not the usual nightmares of gunfire and death, but quieter moments with Duke. He remembered teaching the German Shepherd to detect tripwires by burying practice devices around their base camp. Duke had learned with the same uncanny intelligence that Ranger displayed, the same ability to read Sam's moods and anticipate his needs. Sam woke to find Ranger sitting beside the bed, alert and watching the windows as if expecting trouble. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., and the desert outside was silent except for the distant howl of coyotes. But something had disturbed Ranger's sleep, and 47 years of surviving in hostile territory had taught Sam to trust a dog's instincts over human overconfidence. Moving carefully to avoid creaking floorboards, Sam retrieved the .45 from his nightstand and padded to the living room window. At first he saw nothing but familiar shadows and moonlit scrub brush. Then movement caught his eye. A figure crouched near his tool shed, doing something with small electronic devices, surveillance equipment. Someone was planting bugs around his property, probably at Webb's direction. Sam felt a cold fury settle in his chest. The same controlled rage that had kept him alive in combat zones where civilization's rules no longer applied. He'd survived 2 tours in Vietnam, buried his wife, and endured 3 years of grief that would have broken lesser men. He'd be damned if some soft-handed developer was going to drive him from the only home he had left. Sam slipped out the back door with Ranger at his side, moving with the silent precision that never completely fades from a soldier's muscle memory. The intruder was so focused on his electronic work that he never heard them approach. When Sam pressed the .45's barrel against the back of his neck, the man nearly jumped out of his skin. "Easy, friend," Sam said quietly. "Keep your hands where I can see them and turn around real slow." The man who faced him was young, maybe 30, with the lean build and alert eyes of former military. His clothing was all black, his equipment professional grade. This wasn't some local thug hired off the street. This was a specialist, someone with training and resources. "You're making a mistake, old man," the intruder said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "I'm just doing a job. This doesn't have to get complicated." "Already is complicated," Sam replied. "Question is whether it gets ugly too. Who sent you?" The man's silence was answer enough. Sam recognized the look of someone who'd been taught to resist interrogation, but he also saw the calculation in the younger man's eyes. Professional or not, getting caught had upset whatever timeline this operation was supposed to follow. "Here's what's going to happen," Sam said. "You're going to collect every piece of equipment you planted on my property. You're going to hand over whatever recording devices you've got running, And then you're going to walk back to wherever you came from and tell your boss that Samuel Richardson isn't some frightened old man who can be intimidated." 20 minutes later, Sam watched the intruder disappear into the desert with a bag full of confiscated surveillance gear. The message had been delivered, but Sam knew this was just the opening skirmish. Webb had resources, patience, and the backing of a corrupt system. He could afford to escalate slowly, applying pressure until something broke. But Sam had advantages too. 47 years of marriage had taught him the value of fighting for what mattered. 3 years of widowhood had shown him that some things were worse than death. And now he had Ranger, a dog whose loyalty and intelligence reminded him daily that some bonds couldn't be purchased or bureaucratically dissolved. The next morning brought news that turned Sam's blood to ice. Dr. Mitchell called with information she'd obtained through veterinary networks. The breeding facility where Ranger might have originated had been shut down by federal authorities 2 weeks earlier. The charges included animal abuse, illegal genetic experimentation, and connections to underground dogfighting operations. "Sam," Mitchell's voice was tight with concern. "If Ranger came from that place, he might have been subjected to conditioning techniques that could make him dangerous. Dogs trained for fighting or security work can have unpredictable triggers. You need to be careful." But as Sam watched Ranger playing gently with a tennis ball in Margaret's garden, careful seemed like the wrong word. The dog showed no signs of aggression or instability. If anything, he was the most emotionally stable creature Sam had encountered since Margaret's death. Whatever training Ranger had received, it had produced loyalty and intelligence rather than violence. Still, Mitchell's warning nagged at him throughout the day. That evening, as he sat on his porch with Ranger at his feet, Sam found himself studying the young dog with new eyes. What secrets lay buried in that intelligent mind? What had Ranger experienced before he'd ended up dying beside a highway? And most troubling of all, what would happen when the people who'd created him decided they wanted him back? The answer came sooner than Sam expected, arriving in the form of a black SUV that pulled into his driveway just after sunset. 2 men in expensive suits climbed out, their movements carrying the casual confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation rather than violence. But as they approached his porch, Sam noticed something that made his blood pressure spike. Ranger had gone rigid beside him, his entire body trembling with suppressed emotion. The dog's ears were flattened against his skull, his lips pulled back to reveal white teeth. For the first time since Sam had found him, Ranger looked genuinely dangerous. Whatever these men represented, Ranger recognized them, and he was afraid. The 2 men who emerged from the black SUV moved with the calculated precision of corporate enforcers, their expensive suits doing little to disguise the predatory nature beneath. The taller one, silver-haired and sharp-featured, introduced himself as Vincent Castellano from something called Apex Securities. His companion, younger but no less intimidating, remained silent and watchful, his eyes constantly scanning Sam's property as if cataloging weaknesses. "Mr. Richardson," Castellano said, his voice carrying the polished authority of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than violence. "We understand you've come into possession of some property that belongs to our organization." Ranger's reaction was immediate and visceral. The young German shepherd pressed himself against Sam's leg, trembling with suppressed terror that made Sam's heart clench. This wasn't the alert wariness of a dog sensing danger. This was the traumatic response of an animal that had experienced genuine horror at these men's hands. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sam said, though his hand instinctively moved to rest on Ranger's head. The dog's fur was standing on end, his breathing rapid and shallow. "This is my property, and everything on it belongs to me." Castellano's smile was winter cold. The animal you're harboring was stolen from a federally licensed research facility. He represents a significant investment in time, resources, and specialized training. We're prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience, but the dog comes with us tonight." The word research hit Sam like a physical blow. He'd heard enough euphemisms in his lifetime to recognize when someone was sanitizing something ugly. Research facilities didn't produce the kind of traumatic response he was seeing in Ranger. Whatever these men had done to the young dog, it had left scars that might never heal. "You got papers proving ownership?" Sam asked, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Bill of sale? Registration documents? Because without legal proof, you're just two strangers on my property making threats." The younger man stepped forward, his hand moving inside his jacket in a gesture that was supposed to look casual but carried an unmistakable message. "Mr. Richardson, we're trying to handle this professionally, but there are other ways to resolve ownership disputes." Sam had faced down armed insurgents in Vietnamese jungles and survived 3 decades of Margaret's stubborn determination. 2 corporate thugs in $1,000 suits didn't rate high on his list of intimidating opponents. "Son, you'd better think real hard about what you do next. This is Arizona. Stand your ground laws mean I can defend my property and my animals with whatever force I deem necessary." Castellano raised a placating hand, but his eyes had gone flat and dangerous. "No one wants violence, Mr. Richardson. We're simply reclaiming stolen property. The dog was taken from our facility during a federal raid based on false allegations. He's evidence in an ongoing investigation, which makes harboring him a federal crime." The lie was smooth and practiced, the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak designed to make victims doubt their own moral authority. But Sam had heard similar lies from officers who'd wanted to cover up war crimes, from politicians who'd wanted to justify sending boys to die in foreign countries, from men who'd learned that the right words could make almost any atrocity seem reasonable. "If he's evidence in a federal investigation," Sam said, "then the FBI would be here with proper warrants, not private security contractors with unregistered weapons." He'd caught the telltale bulge under the younger man's jacket, a shoulder holster worn by someone comfortable with violence. "What I think happened is that your research facility got shut down for animal abuse, and now you're trying to recover your assets before someone with actual authority starts asking uncomfortable questions." Ranger whimpered softly, pressing closer to Sam's leg. The sound was heartbreaking, not the whine of a spoiled pet, but the suppressed sob of a creature that had learned expressing distress only brought more pain. Whatever conditioning these men had subjected him to, it had been designed to break his spirit while preserving his intelligence. Castellano's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, old man. That animal represents months of specialized conditioning worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He's been trained for purposes you couldn't possibly understand." "Try me," Sam said. "I've seen plenty of military and police K-9 units. Hell, I worked with war dogs in Vietnam. But this isn't about training, is it? This is about what you did to him that you can't afford to have examined by legitimate authorities." The accusation hung in the desert air like a challenge. Castellano exchanged a quick glance with his partner, and Sam saw the moment they decided diplomacy had failed. The younger man's hand moved more deliberately toward his weapon, while Castellano stepped back to give his partner room to maneuver. But they'd underestimated both their opponents. Ranger might be traumatized by these men's presence, but his protective instincts toward Sam overrode his fear. As the younger man's gun cleared his jacket, the German Shepherd exploded into motion with speed that defied his age and size. 40 pounds of muscle, teeth, and trained aggression hit the gunman's center mass, driving him backward into his partner. Sam moved with muscle memory forged in combat zones, covering the 15 feet to the struggling men before the younger one could regain his footing. The .45 from Sam's nightstand was suddenly in his hand, though he couldn't remember drawing it. Age might have slowed his reflexes, but it had sharpened his understanding of when talking ended and survival began. "Ranger, off!" Sam commanded, and the dog immediately released his grip on the gunman's arm, though he remained coiled to attack again. The man's expensive suit was torn, blood seeping through the fabric where Ranger's teeth had found purchase. His gun lay in the dirt 10 feet away, having been knocked loose during the brief struggle. "Now we're going to have a different conversation," Sam said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who'd killed when necessary and slept soundly afterward. "You came onto my property armed, threatened me and my dog, and tried to steal what isn't yours. In Arizona, that gives me legal justification to put holes in both of you and claim self-defense." Castellano helped his bleeding partner to his feet. His own composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what you've just done. We represent people who don't accept no for an answer. This isn't over." "Yeah, it is," Sam replied. "Because if I see either of you on my property again, I won't bother with warnings. And if anything happens to my dog, if he disappears, if he gets sick, if he so much as gets a hangnail, I'm going to assume you're responsible. And then I'm going to show you what an old soldier can do when he's got nothing left to lose." The two men retreated to their SUV, the younger one cradling his injured arm, while Castellano made quiet phone calls that Sam assumed involved reporting failure to whoever was pulling their strings. As their vehicle disappeared into the darkness, Sam felt a mixture of satisfaction and dread. He'd won this confrontation, but wars weren't decided by single battles. That night, Sam sat on his porch with Ranger pressed against his leg and tried to understand what he'd gotten himself into. The dog's reaction to those men had confirmed his worst suspicions about the research facility where Ranger had originated. No legitimate training program would produce the kind of traumatic terror he'd witnessed. Someone had done unspeakable things to an innocent animal, and now they wanted him back to either continue the abuse or eliminate evidence of their crimes. Doctor. Mitchell arrived the next morning with coffee and a grim expression, having heard through the small-town grapevine that Sam had received visitors the previous evening. She found him on his porch, Ranger at his feet, both of them watching the road with the alertness of soldiers expecting another attack. "Sarah," Sam said, accepting the coffee gratefully, "tell me about psychological trauma in dogs. How long does it take to overcome conditioning that's designed to break an animal's spirit?" Mitchell studied Ranger thoughtfully. The young German shepherd was calm in her presence, but his eyes never stopped scanning the perimeter of Sam's property. "Depends on the severity and duration of the abuse. Some dogs never fully recover. Others can heal with time, patience, and consistent positive reinforcement. But dogs subjected to systematic trauma often retain hypervigilance and startle responses for life." "What about aggression?" "Those men last night claimed he was trained for violence." "Look at how he reacted," Mitchell said. "He defended you, but he also responded immediately when you told him to stop. That's not the behavior of an animal trained for uncontrolled violence. That's protection instinct combined with discipline, exactly what you'd expect from a dog that bonded with someone who treated him with respect." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Bradley's patrol car, kicking up its usual cloud of dust as it pulled into Sam's driveway. Bradley emerged slowly, his expression carefully neutral, but Sam noticed the man's hand resting on his service weapon. "Sam," Bradley said without preamble, "had a complaint filed this morning. Couple of security contractors claim you threatened them with a firearm and set your dog on them. That's aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, plus animal attack charges." Sam felt his temper rising. "Those men came onto my property armed, threatened to steal my dog, and drew a weapon first. I was defending myself and my property." "That's your story," Bradley said, though his discomfort was obvious. But they've got witnesses, medical records, and a lot more credibility than a retired soldier with known PTSD issues. The casual dismissal of Sam's mental health as a character flaw was the final straw. "Tom, you've known me for 20 years. You really think I'd attack two men unprovoked?" Bradley's silence was answer enough. He'd already decided which version of events would go into his report, probably based on whoever was paying his salary this month. In small towns like Millbrook, corruption was often just a matter of following the path of least resistance. "I'm not arresting you today," Bradley said finally. "But if there's another incident, if these men file formal charges, I'll have to take you in. My advice, find somewhere else for that dog to live." This situation is only going to get worse. As Bradley drove away, Sam realized that his isolated ranch had become a battlefield, and the enemy had more resources than he'd anticipated. They had legal cover, political connections, and enough money to turn local law enforcement into their private army. All Sam had was an old soldier's stubbornness, a traumatized dog, and the absolute certainty that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. The confrontation Sam had been dreading arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, delivered not by corporate thugs or corrupt sheriffs, but by a lean young man with haunted eyes who introduced himself as Jake Morrison. He stood at Sam's front gate with his hands visible and empty, his military bearing unmistakable despite civilian clothes that had seen better days. "Mr. Richardson," Jake called out, his voice carrying the respectful tone of a junior enlisted man addressing a senior NCO. "I'd like to talk if you've got a minute. It's about your dog, but not what you think." Sam studied the younger man from his porch, noting the telltale signs of recent military service, the precise posture, the unconscious habit of scanning for threats, the way he kept his hands away from his waistband to signal peaceful intent. Ranger sat beside Sam, alert but not exhibiting the terror response that had accompanied the previous visitors. "You armed?" Sam asked. "Yes, sir." "Concealed carry permit. But my weapon stays holstered unless you give me reason to think otherwise." The honesty was refreshing after days of lies and manipulation. Sam gestured toward the porch. "Come on up. Coffee's hot." Jake Morrison was 32 years old, with the prematurely aged face of someone who'd seen too much violence too young. His hands shook slightly as he accepted the coffee mug, not from fear, Sam noticed, but from the fine tremor that came with inadequate sleep and too much stress. The story he told over the next 20 minutes explained both symptoms. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan," Jake began, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than Sam's face. "K-9 handler with the 10th Mountain Division. Lost my partner, Rex, to an IED in Kandahar. Came home with a Purple Heart and a case of PTSD that made civilian life complicated." Sam recognized the careful euphemism. Complicated was what veterans called it when they couldn't hold jobs, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't sleep without nightmares that left them screaming themselves awake. He'd been lucky. Margaret had understood, had helped him build a life that could contain his demons. Not everyone was so fortunate. "After the Army, I tried security work," Jake continued. "Private military contractors, mostly. Good money, familiar work environment. But the companies I worked for weren't always ethical. I told myself I was just following orders, same as always, until I got assigned to a facility called Apex Research." The name hit Sam like a physical blow. Apex Research, the same organization Vincent Castellano had claimed to represent. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form a picture that made Sam's blood run cold. "What kind of research?" Sam asked, though he dreaded the answer. Jake's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "They called it Enhanced Canine Development. Psychological conditioning techniques designed to create dogs with specific behavioral modifications. They claimed it was for military and law enforcement applications, but..." He trailed off, staring into his coffee as if seeking absolution in its depths. But they were torturing puppies, Mr. Richardson. Systematic psychological abuse designed to break their spirits and rebuild them as weapons. Dogs that would attack on command and feel nothing. Dogs that could be discarded when they outlived their usefulness. Jake's voice broke slightly. I lasted 3 weeks before I couldn't stomach it anymore. The confession hung in the desert air between them. Sam understood the weight of moral compromise, the way small justifications could lead to participation in horrors that would haunt a man forever. He also understood the courage it took to walk away from steady employment when you had dependents counting on you. "Why are you telling me this?" Sam asked. "Because 3 months ago I helped shut down that facility," Jake said, meeting Sam's eyes for the first time. "I contacted federal authorities, provided evidence, testified before a grand jury. But before the raid, someone warned the management. They destroyed most of their records and moved the surviving dogs to undisclosed locations, all except 3 puppies that escaped during the evacuation." Sam felt his heart skip a beat. 3 puppies! German shepherds. Brothers, actually, from the same litter. They were the most promising subjects in the program, highly intelligent, resilient, capable of forming strong bonds despite the abuse they'd suffered. The facility managers were desperate to recover them because those dogs represented evidence of their crimes. Jake pulled a photograph from his wallet. 3 German shepherd puppies playing together in what looked like a medical facility. Even in the picture, their intelligence was evident in their alert expressions and coordinated movements. One of them, Sam realized with growing certainty, was Ranger. "The other 2 were found and recovered," Jake continued. "One died from injuries sustained during his captivity. The other was so psychologically damaged that he had to be humanely euthanized. But the third one, the one with the distinctive white patch on his left ear, vanished completely." Sam glanced at Ranger, who was lying peacefully in a patch of afternoon sunlight. The white patch Jake described was barely visible unless you knew to look for it, hidden beneath the darker fur that framed the dog's left ear. For weeks, Sam had wondered about that small imperfection in Ranger's otherwise perfect coloring. Now he understood it was an identifying mark that had made this particular dog valuable to monsters. "Mr. Richardson," Jake said, his voice heavy with the weight of past sins, "I need you to know that the people looking for your dog aren't legitimate researchers or security contractors. They're criminals trying to recover evidence that could send them to federal prison for decades. And they'll do whatever it takes to get him back." The admission clarified everything Sam had suspected but hadn't been able to prove. Ranger wasn't just a valuable dog. He was a witness to systematic animal abuse, a living testament to crimes that powerful people wanted erased. No wonder they'd been willing to send armed men to recover him. "There's something else," Jake continued. "The man funding the Apex facility, the one who developed the conditioning protocols, his name is Marcus Webb. He's got connections throughout state and local government, enough money to buy silence from anyone who might interfere with his operations." The research facility was just one part of a larger network of illegal activities. The revelation hit Sam like a lightning bolt. Marcus Webb, the polite developer who'd been pressuring him to sell his ranch, was the same man who'd been torturing dogs for profit. The land acquisition wasn't about resort development. It was about eliminating witnesses and covering up evidence. "Jesus Christ," Sam whispered. "He's been trying to buy my land to get access to Ranger." "That's what I figured when I heard about the pressure campaign against you," Jake said. "Webb can't risk having that dog examined by legitimate authorities. Ranger's behavioral patterns, his response to specific triggers, it would all point back to the Apex program. Webb needs him dead or disappeared, and he needs you silenced as well." Sam felt the familiar cold certainty that had kept him alive in combat zones settling into his bones. This wasn't just about protecting a dog anymore. This was about exposing a criminal conspiracy that had tortured innocent animals and would kill anyone who threatened to reveal their crimes. "Jake," Sam said carefully, "I assume you didn't come here just to ease your conscience. What do you want from me?" The younger man met his eyes with the desperate hope of someone seeking redemption for past failures. "I want to help you stop them, Mr. Richardson. I want to make sure that dog gets the justice he deserves and that the bastards who hurt him pay for what they've done." The truth came in fragments over the following days, each revelation more devastating than the last. Jake Morrison proved to be a meticulous investigator, arriving each morning with new evidence gathered from his network of former military contacts and whistleblowers who'd worked within Webb's criminal empire. What emerged was a conspiracy that reached far beyond animal abuse into human trafficking, illegal weapons sales, and the systematic corruption of local government officials. "Webb's been operating in Arizona for 15 years, Jake explained, spreading photographs and documents across Sam's kitchen table. The dog breeding program was just his latest venture. Before that, he ran private military training camps for mercenaries, illegal firearms manufacturing, even human trafficking routes from Mexico. He uses his development company as a front to launder money and buy political protection." Sam studied the evidence with growing horror and rage. Financial records showed payments to Sheriff Bradley dating back 5 years. Property transfers revealed that Webb had acquired over 3,000 acres of desert land through intimidation, fraud, and violence against previous owners. Most damning of all were medical records from an underground veterinary clinic documenting systematic torture disguised as behavioral conditioning research. "Margaret," Sam whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Her cancer wasn't natural, was it?" Jake's expression grew grim. "The well water analysis I had done shows elevated levels of industrial chemicals consistent with deliberate contamination. Webb's been poisoning anyone who won't sell to him, making it look like environmental cancer clusters. Your wife wasn't his first victim, Mr. Richardson. She wasn't even his 10th. The coffee mug in Sam's hand shattered against the kitchen floor, ceramic shards scattering like his composure. Margaret had died slowly, painfully, wasting away while doctors searched for explanations that never came. She'd trusted the medical system, trusted that someone would find a cure, trusted that her husband would somehow save her. Instead, she'd been murdered by a monster who wanted her land more than he valued her life. "How many?" Sam asked, his voice barely controlled. 14 confirmed deaths over the past 8 years, all property owners who refused to sell, all diagnosed with aggressive cancers that didn't respond to treatment. The pattern is obvious once you know what to look for. But Webb's got enough medical professionals on his payroll to ensure the deaths never get connected. Ranger sensed the emotional storm building in Sam and pressed against his legs, offering the wordless comfort that had sustained him through 3 years of grief. But this time, comfort wasn't enough. This time, Sam felt the cold fury that had carried him through combat zones where civilization's rules no longer applied. Webb hadn't just stolen his wife. He'd stolen his chance to save her, his opportunity to fight for the woman he loved more than his own life. "There's more," Jake continued reluctantly. "Dr. Mitchell called this morning. Someone broke into her clinic last night, destroyed all of Ranger's medical records. They also planted cocaine in her office and called in an anonymous tip to the DEA. She's been arrested on drug trafficking charges." The systematic elimination of allies was a tactic Sam recognized from counterinsurgency operations. Webb was closing off escape routes, isolating his targets, preparing for a final assault that would leave no witnesses alive. Dr. Mitchell's arrest meant Sam had lost his only ally in the legitimate medical community, the one person who could have testified about Ranger's condition and the abuse he'd suffered. "Jake," Sam said carefully, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to do isn't legal, and it isn't safe. If you want to walk away, now's the time." The younger man met his eyes with the steady resolve of someone who'd already crossed too many moral lines to worry about a few more. "Mr. Richardson, I've been running from what I did at that facility for months. I've watched good people die while bad people got richer. I'm done running." That evening, Sam sat on his porch with Ranger and tried to reconcile the man he'd been with the man he was about to become. For 47 years, he'd been a husband, a citizen, a member of a community that believed in laws and justice and the fundamental decency of human nature. But laws could be purchased, justice could be corrupted, and human decency was a luxury that monsters like Webb couldn't afford to tolerate. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "Sam, you can't save everyone, but you can save someone." She'd been talking about stray dogs and wounded birds, but the principle applied to larger battles. He couldn't bring back the 14 people Webb had murdered, couldn't undo the torture Ranger had endured, couldn't restore the innocence that men like Castellano had stolen from the world. But he could save someone. He could save the next victim, and the one after that, by ensuring Webb never hurt anyone again. The plan that emerged over the next 48 hours was elegantly simple. Webb's weakness was his arrogance. He believed his money and connections made him untouchable, that an old soldier and a traumatized dog posed no real threat to his empire. He would come for them personally, confident that superior numbers and firepower would overwhelm any resistance. Sam intended to prove him wrong. Jake's military contacts provided surveillance equipment, weapons, and tactical intelligence about Webb's security arrangements. More importantly, they provided something Sam hadn't expected: volunteers. Word had spread through veteran networks about the dog torture facility, about the murdered property owners, about the systematic corruption that protected monsters while punishing those who tried to expose them. 12 guys won in, Jake reported on Friday morning. All combat veterans, all with personal grudges against men like Webb. They're not doing this for money or glory. They're doing it because it's right. Sam felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Hope, not for himself. He was too old and too damaged to expect a happy ending, but for the idea that justice might still be possible in a world that seemed determined to reward cruelty and punish compassion. "Tell them yes," Sam said. "But make sure they understand this isn't a rescue mission. This is a reckoning." The end came on a Saturday evening in late November, when the desert air carried the promise of winter and the shadows stretched long across Sam's property. Webb arrived as Sam had predicted he would, with overwhelming force and absolute confidence, leading a convoy of 3 black SUVs filled with armed contractors who expected to face nothing more dangerous than an old man and his dog. They were wrong. Sam watched from his concealed position in the tool shed as 12 armed men deployed around his ranch with military precision. They moved well, he had to admit. These weren't street thugs or corporate security guards, but professional soldiers accustomed to violence in foreign countries where rules of engagement were suggestions rather than laws. Webb had spared no expense in assembling his strike team. But Sam had advantages Webb couldn't have anticipated. He knew every inch of this land, every depression and rock formation that could provide cover. More importantly, he had Jake Morrison and 11 other combat veterans positioned throughout the property, men who'd volunteered for this fight not for money, but for the satisfaction of seeing justice done to those who preyed on the innocent. "Ranger, stay," Sam whispered to the German shepherd crouched beside him. The dog's eyes reflected the dying sunlight, alert and ready, but disciplined enough to wait for the command that would unleash 40 pounds of trained fury on men who'd tortured his brothers. Webb himself remained by the lead vehicle, confident that his hired killers could handle whatever resistance they encountered. He was dressed in expensive tactical gear that had probably never seen real combat, playing at being a soldier while better men did the dying for him. The sight of the man who'd murdered Margaret triggered a rage in Sam that threatened to overwhelm his tactical discipline. "Richardson!" Webb called out, his voice amplified by a battery-powered megaphone. "I know you're here. This doesn't have to end badly. Send out the dog and we can discuss terms." The arrogance was breathtaking. Even now, even with a dozen armed men at his disposal, Webb believed he could negotiate his way out of accountability. He'd spent so many years buying silence and intimidating victims that he'd forgotten some men couldn't be purchased or frightened into submission. Sam keyed the radio microphone Jake had provided. "All positions, weapons free. Remember, Webb is mine." The first shots came from the contractors advancing on the house. Automatic weapons fire that shattered windows and splintered the wooden siding Margaret had painted yellow all those years ago. They were shooting blind, hoping to flush out resistance through overwhelming firepower. It was a tactic that worked well against frightened civilians, but poorly against disciplined soldiers who'd learned patience in places where impatience meant death. Jake Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Contact left. 2 tangos moving on the barn." The response was immediate and devastating. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions throughout Sam's property as 12 veterans opened fire with the coordinated precision of men who'd fought together in places whose names couldn't be found on any map. The contractors' advance stalled as they realized they weren't facing a helpless old man, but a coordinated ambush executed by people who understood violence in ways they'd never been taught. "Fall back!" someone screamed. "Fall back to the vehicles!" But falling back required crossing open ground where Sam's allies had clear fields of fire. 3 contractors went down in the first 30 seconds, their expensive gear and superior numbers useless against opponents who'd learned their craft in places where mistakes were measured in body bags rather than performance reviews. Webb's confident voice on the megaphone became increasingly desperate. "Richardson, this is pointless. You can't win. I have resources you can't imagine." "So did the Viet Cong," Sam muttered, adjusting his grip on the rifle that had once belonged to his father. He'd hoped never to kill again, had spent 47 years believing his fighting days were behind him. But some men chose evil so completely that violence became the only language they understood. The battle lasted 18 minutes. When it was over, 7 of Webb's contractors lay dead in Sam's front yard, their blood soaking into the same earth where Margaret had once grown prize-winning roses. The survivors had fled into the desert, abandoning their employer to face the consequences of his choices alone. Webb himself cowered behind his bullet-riddled SUV, his tactical gear torn and bloodied, his megaphone silent. All his money, all his connections, all his purchased authority had proved worthless against men who fought not for profit but for principle. He looked up at Sam with the desperate eyes of a coward who'd finally encountered something he couldn't buy or intimidate. "Please," Webb whispered, "I can make you rich. Richer than you've ever imagined. Just let me go." Sam studied the man who'd murdered his wife, who'd tortured innocent animals, who'd corrupted an entire community for his own profit. Part of him wanted to kill Webb immediately, to put a bullet in his brain and end the threat he represented. But Margaret's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that justice and vengeance weren't the same thing. "Jake," Sam called out, "you still recording this?" Morrison emerged from his concealment with a digital camera that had captured everything. Webb's arrival with armed contractors, the unprovoked attack on Sam's property, the desperate attempt to murder witnesses to his crimes. And the footage would provide all the evidence federal prosecutors needed to ensure Webb never hurt anyone again. "Got it all," Jake confirmed. "Including his confession about the other murders? This son of a bitch is going to federal prison for the rest of his life." Webb's face crumpled as he realized the scope of his defeat. Not only had he failed to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes, he'd provided additional evidence of his guilt by attacking them with illegal mercenaries. His empire of corruption was crumbling, and everyone who'd taken his money would now be scrambling to distance themselves from his toxicity. As sirens wailed in the distance, honest FBI agents summoned by Jake's contacts rather than corrupt local police, Sam knelt beside Ranger and stroked the dog's fur. The German Shepherd had remained perfectly disciplined throughout the battle, waiting for commands that never came because his presence had been enough. He represented something Webb could never understand. Loyalty that couldn't be purchased. Bonds forged through love rather than fear. "It's over, boy," Sam whispered. "The bad men can't hurt you anymore." But even as he spoke the words, Sam knew they weren't entirely true. Men like Webb were symptoms of a larger disease, and defeating one didn't cure the infection that allowed such monsters to flourish. Still, for tonight at least, justice had been served. Margaret could rest peacefully, knowing her murderer would face consequences for his crimes, and perhaps that was enough. 3 months later, Sam Richardson stood in the transformed courtyard of what had once been his solitary ranch, watching 12 military veterans work with their therapy dogs in the golden light of an Arizona spring morning. The healing center that had grown from tragedy now housed the Samuel and Margaret Richardson Foundation for Veterans and Rescue Animals, a place where broken soldiers could find peace alongside animals who understood trauma in ways that words could never express. Jake Morrison had become Sam's partner in running the facility, his guilt over past failures channeled into a fierce dedication to helping others avoid the darkness that had nearly consumed him. Together, they'd created something Margaret would have loved, a sanctuary where love conquered fear, where second chances bloomed like desert wildflowers after rare rain. Ranger, now fully grown into a magnificent German Shepherd, served as the facility's unofficial ambassador. His transformation from traumatized puppy to confident therapy dog proved daily that healing was possible, that love could overcome even the most systematic cruelty. He worked primarily with veterans suffering from PTSD, his intuitive understanding of human pain making him uniquely qualified to guide others through their journey toward wholeness. "Mr. Richardson," called Tommy Walsh, a young Marine who'd lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan. His new companion, a rescued pit bull named Hope, sat perfectly at his wheelchair's side. "Rex here just passed his final evaluation. He's ready to go home with the Hendersons." Sam smiled as he watched the Henderson family, grandparents who'd lost their son in Iraq, meet the German Shepherd mix who would help them navigate their grief. Rex had arrived at the Foundation as an aggressive, fear-bitten rescue from one of Webb's former facilities. Now he radiated the calm confidence of a dog who'd learned to trust again, who understood that humans could be sources of love rather than pain. The legal aftermath of that November night had unfolded exactly as Jake had predicted. Marcus Webb was serving 3 consecutive life sentences in federal prison, his empire dismantled and his co-conspirators scattered to their own cells. Sheriff Bradley had been convicted of corruption and civil rights violations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, cleared of all charges, had become the Foundation's chief veterinarian and Sam's closest friend outside of his extended family of veterans and rescue animals. But the true victory wasn't measured in prison sentences or legal vindications. It lived in moments like this, watching former enemies of society find purpose in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, seeing damaged souls recognize their own worth through service to others who'd survived similar darkness. "Sam," Dr. Mitchell approached with a clipboard and a smile that still reminded him of Margaret's gentle warmth. "The state inspection team just finished their review. We've been approved for expanded funding. 60 more dogs, 20 additional veterans in the residential program. The numbers represented lives that would be saved, futures that would be rebuilt, second chances that would bloom in the desert soil where Margaret's roses still grew wild and beautiful." Sam had learned that grief could be transformed into purpose, that loss could become the foundation for something greater than what had been destroyed. As the afternoon training sessions wound down, Sam found himself where he ended every day, sitting beside Margaret's grave in the small cemetery he'd built behind the main house. Her headstone now had company, markers for Jimmy Cooper, for the dogs who'd died in Webb's laboratories, for the 14 neighbors whose only crime had been refusing to surrender their homes to a madman's greed. "You'd be proud of what this place has become," Sam said to Margaret's memory, his voice carrying across the desert evening. "It's not just about the dogs anymore. It's about proving that love is stronger than hate, that good people can still win if they're willing to fight for what matters." Ranger settled beside him with the contentment of a dog who'd found his purpose. The foundation had received dozens of adoption applications for the remarkable German Shepherd, offers from wealthy families who wanted to own a piece of his story. Sam had turned them all down. Some bonds couldn't be transferred or purchased. They could only be honored through lifelong commitment. The desert sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had welcomed Sam home from Vietnam all those years ago. But this evening felt different, charged with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a promise kept. Margaret's vision of saving the broken and forgotten had expanded beyond her wildest dreams, encompassing not just stray animals, but wounded warriors who'd found healing through service to creatures who understood their pain. Jake Morrison joined him for their evening ritual, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the quiet camaraderie of men who'd shared both battle and redemption. "The Anderson family called," he reported. "Their son Ryan completed his first week at college, says Duke helped him find the confidence to leave home again." Duke, a 3-legged German shepherd who'd been scheduled for euthanasia before the foundation intervened, had become Ryan Anderson's constant companion, helping the young veteran overcome the agoraphobia that had kept him housebound for 2 years after his combat deployment. Now Ryan was studying veterinary medicine, planning to return as the Foundation's next staff doctor. "That's 14 success stories this month," Sam observed. 14 families put back together, 14 futures restored. "Margaret would say that's 14 reasons to keep going," Jake replied, understanding the significance of the number. 14, the same count as Webb's murder victims, now balanced by 14 lives saved and restored. As darkness settled over the desert, Sam felt a peace he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. The Foundation would continue long after he was gone, sustained by the growing community of people who understood that healing happened not through isolation, but through connection, not through forgetting trauma, but through transforming it into strength. "Come on, Ranger," Sam said, rising stiffly from his chair beside Margaret's grave. "Let's go check on the new arrivals." The German shepherd rose gracefully, pressing briefly against Sam's leg in the gesture that had sustained them both through their darkest moments. Together, they walked toward the main house where 12 veterans and their canine partners were sharing dinner, sharing stories, sharing the kind of brotherhood that could only be forged through mutual understanding of loss and redemption. Behind them, Margaret's roses released their evening fragrance into the desert air, a reminder that love planted in good soil could bloom for generations, nurturing hope in places where despair had once seemed absolute. The foundation that bore her name would ensure that no veteran faced their battles alone, that no animal suffered without advocates, that the legacy of 2 people who'd believed in the power of compassion would continue healing wounded souls long after their own stories had ended. Fellow Americans, like Sam Richardson, many of us carry invisible wounds from life's battles, whether from military service, losing loved ones, or feeling forgotten by a world that seems to have moved on without us. But Sam's story reminds us that our greatest victories often come not from what we accumulate, but from what we give away. At 68, widowed and grieving, Sam discovered that saving one abandoned puppy could transform not just his own life, but an entire community. His pain became his purpose. His loss became his legacy. We may think our best years are behind us, but sometimes our most meaningful chapters begin when we choose to serve something greater than ourselves. The love we show to those who cannot repay us, whether they have 2 legs or 4, becomes the love that ultimately saves us. Have you ever found unexpected purpose through helping others during your own difficult times? What ranger in your life, whether person or pet, helped you discover that your story wasn't over, just beginning a new chapter?